The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the parched sand of the Egyptian coastline as Lieutenant Commander William Ferris squinted through his binoculars at the distant horizon. July 1942. The war in North Africa hung in a precarious balance. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed the British Eighth Army back to El Alamein, the last defensive position before Alexandria and the Suez Canal. The Desert Fox seemed unstoppable, his tactical brilliance matched only by his audacity. What Rommel didn't know was that an invisible army was being created to haunt his dreams, an army that existed primarily in his imagination. The British had turned deception into an art form, and the Commandos were their master painters on this canvas of war. Ferris lowered his binoculars and turned to face the group of men gathered around him. They weren't the usual soldiers one might expect to find in the desert. Among them were artists, actors, engineers, and intelligence officers, members of what had become known as a force, the Strategic Deception Unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark. The Mediterranean theatre had become a stage for their elaborate productions, performances meant for an audience of one, German intelligence. Ferris had been seconded from naval intelligence to assist with what Clark had termed Operation Sentinel, a phantom operation designed to convince the Germans that a new commando force was preparing to strike behind Axis lines. The sun glinted off the distinctive insignia newly sewn onto the shoulders of their uniforms, the winged dagger of the Special Air Service. But these weren't actual SAS operators. The real commandos were elsewhere, conducting genuine operations with minimal personnel. These men were decoys, part of an elaborate charade. Their job was simple yet audacious: to be seen, to leave evidence, to create footprints in the sand that would lead German intelligence analysts down carefully constructed labyrinths of misinformation. "Gentlemen," Ferris addressed the group, his voice carrying across the hot desert air, "today we begin our non-existent assault on an imaginary objective with our invisible army." A ripple of knowing laughter passed through the group. These were men who understood the absurdity and brilliance of their task. They were creating ghosts to frighten the enemy, phantom divisions that would force Rommel to divert precious resources away from the front lines. In war, deception had always been a weapon, but the British had elevated it to a science, and nowhere was this more evident than in the Mediterranean theatre, where the terrain itself, mountains, desert, and sea, provided the perfect backdrop for their elaborate illusions. The genesis of this shadow war could be traced back to the desperate days of 1940, when Britain stood alone against the Axis powers. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, recognizing the need for unconventional warfare, had called for the creation of specially trained troops of the hunter class who could carry the fight to the enemy through raids and sabotage operations. The result was the formation of the Commandos, elite units drawn from volunteers across the armed forces. But even as these real commando forces took shape, military planners recognized the potential for deception operations to amplify their impact far beyond their actual numbers. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, a visionary in the realm of military deception, had been appointed to head A-Force, a specialized unit dedicated to strategic deception in the Middle East. Clark understood the psychology of military intelligence and the power of suggestion. He knew that properly executed deception operations could influence enemy decisions at the highest levels, potentially altering the course of the war. And he found in the Mediterranean theatre the perfect environment for his work, a vast, diverse region where limited forces needed to create the impression of much greater strength. The heat was oppressive as the men loaded equipment into the vehicles, real equipment that would be photographed, documented, and then largely packed away again. They assembled dummy tanks made of wood and canvas that from aerial reconnaissance would be indistinguishable from the real thing. They erected radio masts that would transmit coded messages meant to be intercepted. They prepared to leave tracks in the desert, traces of a substantial force gathering for an operation that would never come. And all of this theatrical performance served one purpose: to make the enemy believe that a large commando force was preparing to strike deep behind Axis lines in Libya. Major Thomas Barker, a theatre director before the war, supervised as his men positioned the inflatable tanks in formation. "Make sure they cast the right shadows," he called out, understanding that German reconnaissance planes would be looking for exactly such details. "Remember, gentlemen, we're playing to the aerial gallery today." The deception units had learned that the most convincing lies contained elements of truth. Real commandos had indeed penetrated behind enemy lines in the desert on several occasions. The deception simply magnified these raids, transforming them in enemy intelligence assessments from pinprick operations into the precursors of major assaults. The ingenuity of these deceptions lay in their layered complexity. Each element reinforced the others, creating a tapestry of falsehood so interwoven with truth that separating one from the other became nearly impossible for German intelligence. A genuine commando raid on a coastal installation might be followed by the deliberate leaking of documents, suggesting it was merely a reconnaissance for a much larger operation. Fake radio traffic would reference the raid while discussing fictional preparations for this non-existent follow-up assault. Double agents would report increased activity, consistent with the gathering of forces, and aerial reconnaissance would reveal the dummy installations and equipment that seemed to confirm everything else. Captain Edward Richards, formerly of the Royal Shakespeare Company, approached Ferris with a dusty map case under his arm. The actor-turned-intelligence officer had embraced his role in this grand production with professional enthusiasm. "Sir," he reported with barely suppressed amusement, "our theatrical troupe is ready for their debut. The stage is set, the props are in place, and we await only the audience." Richards had been instrumental in creating the personal touches that made their deceptions convincing. The subtle details of camp life, the realistic patterns of vehicle movement, even the footprints around latrines that suggested the presence of hundreds of men rather than dozens. As the afternoon wore on, the phantom camp took shape. Smoke rose from cooking fires that prepared meals for men who weren't there. Radio operators sent encrypted messages about units that didn't exist. Military police directed traffic at crossroads, where the only vehicles were those of the deception team itself. To a passing reconnaissance aircraft, it would appear that a significant force was assembling. German intelligence analysts would dutifully report these sightings, and somewhere in a command post, decisions would be made based on this phantom menace. Perhaps reserves would be held back, perhaps defenses would be reinforced in the wrong location. The Mediterranean sun cast long shadows as the day progressed, turning the landscape into a tableau of light and dark that seemed metaphorically appropriate for their work. The deception team moved with practiced efficiency, each man understanding his role in this elaborate charade. They had performed similar operations before, creating phantom armies that existed only in report files and on German situation maps. But this operation was different in its specificity and purpose. It was designed not just to create general uncertainty, but to influence particular German decisions regarding the deployment of reserves and anti-commando units. Lieutenant James Collins, a signals specialist who had worked with Clark since the earliest days of A-Force, supervised the radio deception element of the operation. Under his guidance, operators transmitted messages using the codes and procedures of genuine commando units, but with content carefully crafted to support the deception narrative. "The beauty of it," Collins explained to a newly assigned operator, "is that they know we use codes, so they expect to have to work to understand our messages. By the time they've broken the encryption, they've invested so much in the process that they're predisposed to believe what they've uncovered." The deception was multi-layered, with each element reinforcing the others. The British had captured German intelligence officers and knew the questions they would ask, the signs they would look for. They played to this audience with the precision of master performers. Double agents fed information to their German handlers, confirmation of what aerial reconnaissance had spotted. Fake documents were allowed to fall into enemy hands, apparently by accident. Radio traffic created the communication signature of a large formation. And in neutral diplomatic circles, carefully planted rumors circulated about commando activities. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Ferris gathered his team for a final briefing. The light painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold, transforming the harsh terrain into something almost beautiful. It was in this moment, with the day's heat beginning to dissipate, that the true magnitude of their undertaking struck him. They were fighting a war of the mind, attempting to plant ideas in the enemy's consciousness that would flower into strategic miscalculations. "Tomorrow," he told them, "2 actual commandos will make an appearance in Cairo, wearing the insignia of our fictional unit. They'll visit hotels, talk perhaps too loudly in bars, leave documents in places where we know German sympathizers will spot them. Meanwhile, we'll continue building our phantom army here." The operation was part of a broader strategy that extended beyond North Africa to encompass the entire Mediterranean theater. Similar deceptions were being conducted in Cyprus, Palestine, and Syria, all designed to convince Axis intelligence that Allied strength in the region was far greater than reality. Phantom divisions populated situation maps in German headquarters. Non-existent armor formations appeared to be gathering for offensives that would never be launched. And commando units, both real and imagined, seemed to threaten every vulnerable point along the extended Axis defensive perimeter. The desert grew cold as darkness fell. Stars appeared in the clear sky with remarkable clarity, navigational beacons that had guided travelers across these sands for thousands of years. The men of the deception unit lit fires and settled in for the night, a real encampment pretending to be a pretend one, layers of deception that sometimes confused even those participating in the charade. Ferris sat with Clark, the mastermind of A-Force, discussing the next phase of their operation. "The true art," Clark said, warming his hands by the fire, "is not just to deceive, but to deceive with purpose. We don't just want Rommel to believe commandos are operating behind his lines. We want him to commit resources to countering a threat that doesn't exist." Clark had pioneered these techniques, understanding that modern warfare was as much about perception as reality. In the Mediterranean theater, with its limited resources, forcing the enemy to deploy troops and equipment inefficiently could be as effective as defeating them in battle. The deception operations had taken on a life of their own, with phantom armies moving across maps in German headquarters, influencing real strategic decisions. Clark's insights were born of hard experience. The early days of the war had seen British forces outmanned and outgunned across the Mediterranean. Conventional military wisdom suggested concentrating forces for maximum impact, but Clark had recognized that in the realm of deception, dispersion could be a strength. By creating the impression of threats across a wide area, a force could force the enemy to disperse their own resources in response. It was a strategy particularly well suited to the Mediterranean theater, with its vast coastlines and numerous potential landing points for amphibious operations. The morning brought renewed activity as the deception continued. False radio transmissions indicated the arrival of commando reinforcements. Vehicles drove in circles, creating the impression of heavy traffic. Engineers constructed mock landing craft by the coast, suggesting an amphibious capability that didn't exist, and all of it was designed to be seen, to be reported, to feed the German intelligence machine with precisely calculated misinformation. The real British commandos, meanwhile, operated in small, highly mobile groups, striking targets of opportunity before melting away. Their actual impact on the course of the Desert War was limited, but their psychological effect, amplified by Clark's deceptions, was profound. The birth of the Special Air Service itself illustrated the power of these deception techniques. Originally created by A-Force as a fictional unit to frighten the Italians with the threat of airborne operations, the SAS had subsequently become real when Lieutenant David Sterling proposed the creation of an actual Special Forces unit to operate behind enemy lines. The fictional unit had, in essence, inspired the creation of its real counterpart, a case of life imitating art, of deception becoming reality. And as the real SAS began conducting operations in the desert, their activities were magnified by continued deception efforts, creating the impression of a much larger and more ubiquitous force. Sergeant Michael Davenport, a former stage manager now serving with the deception unit, understood the theatrical nature of their work better than most. "In the theater," he explained to a newly arrived officer, "we create willing suspension of disbelief for an audience that wants to be entertained. Here we create unwilling belief in an audience that's desperately trying to see through our performance." Davenport had applied his theatrical skills to numerous deception operations, creating convincing sets that, when viewed from the right angles by reconnaissance aircraft, suggested military activities far beyond what was actually occurring. The Mediterranean War was unique in many ways, a theater where the ancient and modern collided. Allied forces fought across landscapes that had seen the armies of Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon. The harsh environment itself was as much an enemy as the Axis forces. In this setting, the use of deception had historical precedent stretching back thousands of years. The British Commandos and deception units were simply adding new chapters to the ancient art of misdirection, using modern technology to create modern illusions. Lieutenant James Morris, a former archaeology student who had excavated Roman ruins in North Africa before the war, reflected on this as he helped position a dummy artillery piece. "The Romans would have appreciated what we're doing," he commented to Ferris. "They understood that wars are won in the mind as much as on the battlefield." Morris had a unique perspective on their activities, seeing the continuity between ancient and modern military deceptions. The desert preserves things, he added, gesturing to the landscape around them. Centuries from now, some future archaeologist might find traces of our phantom army and wonder about the battle that was never fought here. The success of these deception operations could be measured in concrete terms. German intelligence reports, later captured and analyzed, consistently overestimated Allied strength in the Mediterranean theater by 30 to 40%. Axis forces were dispersed to defend against threats that didn't exist, weakening their position at critical points, and limited Allied resources achieved effects far beyond their actual capabilities by creating the impression of much greater strength. The Commandos, both real and phantom, played a crucial role in this strategy, their actual and fictional operations blending into a confusing tapestry that German intelligence struggled to unravel. As the North African campaign progressed toward its conclusion in early 1943, the focus of Mediterranean deception operations shifted to support the next phase of Allied strategy, the invasion of Sicily. This represented a new challenge for Clark's A Force and the various deception units operating throughout the theater. They now needed to convince the German High Command that the obvious target, Sicily, was merely a diversion, while the actual landings would occur elsewhere, perhaps in Greece, Sardinia, or the Balkans. It was a deception of unprecedented scale and complexity. Operation Mincemeat became the centerpiece of this deception strategy, perhaps the most audacious and successful deception operation of the entire war. A corpse dressed as a British officer, carrying seemingly authentic documents outlining plans for landings in Greece rather than Sicily, was released off the coast of Spain, where the body and the documents would fall into German hands. The operation required meticulous attention to detail, from the creation of a convincing fictional identity for the dead officer to the crafting of documents that would appear genuine enough to deceive German intelligence analysts. Captain Martin Williamson, who had worked with both A Force and naval intelligence, was involved in the planning for Operation Mincemeat. The brilliance of it, he later explained, lay in playing to German expectations. They already suspected that Sicily was too obvious a target, that it must be a diversion. We simply provided them with confirmation of what they were predisposed to believe. The deception worked spectacularly well, with German forces diverted to Greece and other locations, leaving Sicily more vulnerable to the actual Allied landings. The Mediterranean Commandos were integral to maintaining this fiction, conducting raids and reconnaissance missions that supported the broader deception narrative. Small teams would strike targets in Greece and the Balkans, creating the impression of preparations for a major landing. Radio operators would generate traffic, suggesting the presence of larger forces than actually existed, and all the while, the real invasion force gathered for the assault on Sicily, hidden in plain sight by the very expectations the deception units had created in the minds of German intelligence analysts. Captain Michael Cumberledge, a commando officer who had operated extensively in the Greek islands, understood the power of these psychological operations. The Germans see shadows now where there are none, he told his men, as they prepared for a raid on Rhodes in early 1943. Our job is to make the shadows real enough to touch, just for a moment, and then disappear again. Cumberledge's team would land briefly, create evidence of a reconnaissance in force, and then withdraw, leaving German commanders to wonder if this was the prelude to the major invasion their intelligence services had warned them about. The Special Boat Section, later Squadron, operating throughout the Mediterranean, conducted numerous raids on Greek and Aegean islands that served this dual purpose, achieving limited tactical objectives while supporting the broader deception strategy. These maritime commandos, using small boats and canoes to approach their targets silently at night, embodied the original Churchillian concept of butcher and bolt operations. Their actual military impact might be limited. A radar station destroyed, a small garrison eliminated, but their psychological effect was magnified by the deception operations that framed their activities as precursors to much larger actions. Lieutenant Commander Patrick Clayton, a veteran of special operations in the Aegean, described the mindset required for such missions. You must think of yourself as both the blade and the shadow of the blade, he told new recruits. The damage you inflict is real, but the fear you create is greater still. Clayton's teams had conducted operations on numerous Greek islands, each carefully selected not just for its tactical significance, but for its value in the broader deception narrative. A raid on an isolated island might have limited military impact, but if it supported the fiction of preparations for a major landing, its strategic value was immeasurable. The Greek landscape, with its rugged mountains and countless islands, was ideal for such operations. Commandos could appear suddenly from the sea, strike with precision, and vanish again before substantial forces could respond. Each raid, however small in actual military impact, reinforced the deception narrative being crafted at higher levels. German forces were stretched thin, trying to garrison every potential landing site, unable to concentrate their strength where it might be decisive. It was a strategy of psychological attrition, wearing down the enemy's certainty and confidence, rather than their numbers. The island of Crete, captured by the Germans in 1941 after a costly airborne operation, became a focal point for commando activities and deception operations. Small teams infiltrated the island regularly, gathering intelligence, supporting resistance groups, and conducting sabotage operations. But beyond these genuine military objectives, they also created evidence suggesting these actions were reconnaissance for a much larger invasion force preparing to retake the island. German forces on Crete, already nervous after several successful commando raids, were further reinforced in response to this phantom threat, tying down troops that could have been used elsewhere. Lieutenant George Peterson, who conducted several operations on Crete with a small commando team, described the dual nature of their missions. "We had our actual objectives, blowing up fuel dumps, cutting communications lines, gathering intelligence. But we also carried out our shadow mission, leaving evidence of a larger presence, making sure the Germans found maps and documents suggesting bigger operations to come." Peterson's team would sometimes deliberately leave behind equipment marked with the insignia of units not actually operating in the area, creating the impression of a much larger Allied presence on the island than actually existed. As the war in the Mediterranean progressed, the deception operations evolved in complexity and scale. Phantom armies grew into phantom army groups. Radio networks simulated the communications of entire divisions. Inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft created the signatures of armored and air formations that didn't exist. The British became so proficient at these techniques that by 1944, German intelligence estimates consistently overestimated Allied strength in the theater by as much as 40%. The success of the Sicily deception encouraged Allied planners to employ similar methods on an even larger scale for subsequent operations. As preparations began for the landings in mainland Italy, deception operations created fictitious threats to Sardinia, Corsica, and the Balkans, drawing German attention away from the actual targets. Once again, commando operations played a crucial role in this strategy, conducting raids that seemed to confirm German fears about Allied intentions. The pattern continued throughout the Italian campaign, with phantom threats constantly forcing the Germans to disperse their forces to defend multiple potential landing sites. Major William Davidson, who coordinated commando operations in support of the Italian campaign deceptions, explained the psychology behind their approach. "The Germans know we have commandos and special forces operating throughout the Mediterranean. They've felt the sting of our operations many times. So when they detect signs of increased commando activity in a particular area, they naturally assume it presages a larger operation. Our job is to exploit that assumption, to make them see patterns that lead to the conclusions we want them to reach." The light across the Mediterranean changed with the seasons, from the harsh glare of summer to the softer illumination of winter, but the shadow war continued unabated. As Allied forces pushed northward through Italy in 1944, deception operations created phantom threats to the French coast, drawing German reserves away from the actual fighting. Commandos operating along the coastline reinforced these deceptions with raids and reconnaissance activities carefully designed to support the fiction of imminent landings. The commandos remained the tip of the spear in this shadow war. Their real operations gained significance beyond their immediate military objectives by supporting the broader deception narrative. A small raid on a coastal installation might be transformed through careful manipulation of intelligence channels into evidence of preparations for a major landing. The commandos themselves sometimes operated in dual roles, conducting genuine missions while simultaneously creating evidence of fictitious ones. Major William Sterling, brother of SAS founder David Sterling, led a series of operations in the Aegean in 1944 that exemplified this approach. His small teams would strike at German positions, but always leave behind subtle evidence, suggesting the involvement of much larger forces, discarded equipment with the insignia of units not actually present in the theater, maps marked with assembly points for formations that didn't exist, radio codes that, when broken, would reveal plans for operations that were never intended to occur. The psychological impact of these operations extended beyond strategic calculations to affect the morale and effectiveness of German forces. Units stationed in remote areas, constantly anticipating commando raids that never materialized, suffered from the tension of perpetual readiness. Resources were wasted constructing defenses against phantom threats. Command decisions were delayed as conflicting intelligence reports were reconciled. The fog of war, always a factor in military operations, was deliberately thickened by the British deception units until the German command was operating in near blindness. Captain Robert Hamilton, a psychologist before the war who had joined A Force to help understand and exploit enemy thinking, described the cumulative effect of these deceptions. "It's not just about creating false information," he explained, "but about creating a false reality that the enemy lives within." After enough time exposed to our deceptions, German commanders begin to doubt everything they see and hear. They become hesitant, cautious, unwilling to commit to decisions for fear of falling into traps. And in warfare, hesitation is often fatal. The Mediterranean commandos operated in environments of extraordinary beauty and danger. The blue waters of the Aegean, the rugged mountains of Greece, the ancient cities of Italy, these were the backdrops against which their shadow war was conducted. Men who might in peacetime have been tourists appreciating these landscapes instead moved through them as ghosts, appearing and disappearing with the needs of their missions. The contrast between the timeless beauty of the Mediterranean and the brutal modern war being fought across it created a surreal quality that many veterans of these operations would comment on in later years. Lieutenant David Morgan, commando who conducted numerous operations in the Greek islands, described this contradiction in a letter home. "Today we slipped into a bay of such perfect beauty that it seemed impossible that war could touch it. The water was clear as crystal, the hills behind a perfect green against the blue sky. And there we were, blackened faces, weapons at the ready, moving silently toward a German position to bring death and destruction. The contrast was almost unbearable. Yet in a strange way it felt as though we were fighting for the right of such places to exist in peace again." By early 1945, as the war in Europe approached its conclusion, the Mediterranean theater had become a secondary front. Yet the deception operations continued, tying down German forces that might otherwise have been deployed to more critical areas. The commandos, by then operating primarily in northern Italy and the Balkans, maintained the fiction of preparations for major amphibious operations against the Adriatic coast, even as Allied strategy had shifted its focus elsewhere. In these final months of the war, the shadow armies created by A Force reached their peak of sophistication. Entire fictional order of battles were created and maintained, complete with unit histories, commanders' profiles, and detailed equipment inventories. Radio networks simulated the communications of these non-existent formations with such accuracy that German signals intelligence accepted them as genuine, and the commandos, operating in small teams throughout the theater, continued to provide the real-world evidence that seemed to confirm these elaborate fictions. Colonel Thomas McPherson, who oversaw several of these late-war deception operations, reflected on the evolution of their techniques. "When we began in 1940, we were amateurs improvising with whatever came to hand. By 1945, we had developed deception into a science with its own principles and methodologies. We could create entire phantom armies that existed only in the minds of German intelligence analysts, but influenced real strategic decisions. It was warfare at its most cerebral, a contest of intellects rather than firepower. The legacy of these operations extended beyond the war itself. The techniques developed by Clark's A Force and implemented by the commandos and deception units became part of the standard military playbook for future conflicts. The understanding that perception could be as powerful as reality in shaping an adversary's decisions represented a profound evolution in military thinking. And the Mediterranean theater, with its unique combination of geography, history, and circumstance, had provided the perfect laboratory for developing these concepts. As Allied forces celebrated victory in Europe in May 1945, the men who had fought the Shadow War reflected on their unique contributions. They had no famous battles to their names, no decisive engagements where they had met the enemy in direct confrontation. Their victories had been measured in German units deployed to the wrong locations, in resources wasted defending against attacks that never came, in confusion and uncertainty among enemy commanders. They had fought with deception as their primary weapon, and in doing so, had helped shape the course of the war. Captain William Harris, who had served with both commando units and deception operations throughout the Mediterranean, tried to explain the nature of their contribution to a war correspondent in the days after the German surrender. "We didn't win the war," he said, "but we changed the way it was fought. We made the Germans see armies where there were none, threats where none existed. We stretched their resources, undermined their confidence, created uncertainty where there should have been clarity. It's not the kind of warfare that produces medals or monuments, but it saved countless lives on both sides by helping to shorten the conflict." The Mediterranean sun, which had watched over thousands of years of human conflict on its shores, set on the final acts of this shadow war. The phantom armies faded away, their purpose fulfilled. The commandos who had operated in the theater, both as genuine strike forces and as elements of the deception operations, returned to civilian life or moved on to other assignments. The stage was struck, the props packed away, the performance concluded. But the impact remained, not just in the outcome of the war, but in the evolution of military thinking. The British Commandos in the Mediterranean had demonstrated that courage and daring were not limited to direct combat, that intelligence and deception could multiply the effectiveness of limited forces, that wars could be won partly in the mind. Their legacy lives on in the special operations forces of today, who continue to understand that perception shapes reality, that deception remains a powerful weapon, and that shadows sometimes speak louder than substance. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, the visionary who had created A-Force and pioneered many of its techniques, summarized their achievement in his final report. "We created a war within the war, a shadow conflict that the enemy was forced to fight without ever fully understanding its nature. Our weapons were not tanks or artillery, but ideas, not bullets, but suggestions. And in a theater where resources were always limited, where every real tank and soldier had to achieve maximum effect, our phantom armies achieved victories without casualties, our fictional operations influenced real decisions, and our commando raiders became the visible edge of an invisible sword. The war in the Mediterranean was fought not just with guns and tanks, but with imagination and illusion. The British Commandos who operated in this theater were masters of both physical courage and psychological warfare. They created ghosts that haunted the German command, phantoms that influenced real strategic decisions. In doing so, they wrote a unique chapter in military history, one where the boundary between truth and fiction became as fluid as the Mediterranean waters themselves, where deception became an art form, and where victory was measured not just in territory gained, but in minds influenced. The sands of time may cover the physical traces of their operations, but the impact of their shadow war continues to echo through military thinking to this day. Perhaps you too will look differently now at the shadows around you, wondering what truths and deceptions they might contain, what lessons they hold from a time when the art of illusion helped change the course of history.